This is for first name of all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. Continuing with the theme of areas where one could carry on Shabbos. Okay. It says here, here we are. Okay. Okay. It is a mitzvah to pursue the opportunity of making an Eruv. The existence of such an arrangement is likely to reduce the occurrence of desecration of Shabbos. In the melacha of carrying, the public area symbolizes a secular area for all types of people. The enclosed area represents a secluded area in which one finds people who are devoted to Hashem. By confining our belongings to their private areas and abstaining from malacha, we avoid the secular and achieve holiness towards Hashem. And that's from the Al-Sheikh. Rav Mordechai Sasson of Baghdad says, the Eruv indicates an ideal that Jews should not be separated from one another, but should be linked together in harmony. They must maintain a unity just like the practice of the Eruv, which each house participates to form one entity. When making an Eruv, one should devote one's mind to the unity of Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael, and have the intention to correct one's ways. In accordance with the verse, love your neighbor like yourself. Turnus Rufus, I think he was a Roman general during the second base of Mikdash, asked Rabbi Akiva, what makes the Sabbath more important than all the other days of the week? Rabbi Akiva replied, because the King of Kings wishes to honor the Sabbath. If he chooses to honor the Sabbath, then why does he not stop the wind from blowing and the rain from falling on that day? Asked Turnus Rufus. Rabbi Akiva answered, in his own courtyard, a man is permitted by law to carry things on the Sabbath from one place to another. So it is with the Holy One, blessed be he. The whole world is his, and his glory is not shared by any other power. Hence, he can permit these things even on the Sabbath. And that comes from Bereshis Rabbah.
Wow, Kevin, thank you.
That was a nice marshal, nice analogy. All right, guys, listen, I relearned the Gemara and relearned to do whatever, and I figured it out as a very simple way to give it over, and I'm going to do a little bit of review. You'll thank me for this. The review is important, okay? So I think that unless you can give over the share perfectly, a review is going to work, but I don't see it as a waste of time at all. I don't know what you guys think, but I think it's really worthwhile.
It's all good. All good. Gavin, what do you say?
Also, we trust your judgment, Damon. You definitely have
of course.
So if you
feel at a high level, we need to aspire to.
No. But the truth of it is, I did put in a lot of work. So the thing of it is, it's become clear that it needs another bit of review, because even I gained a bit of clarity. So I'm gonna make things a lot more in colloquial language and easier, and I'm just gonna go through it step by step. Okay. So basically, the brisa related to a Mishnah cited. The rabbis taught in a brisa, if one digs a pit in his private domain and opens it to the public domain, he is liable for the damage that it does. And this is the bor that is mentioned in the Torah. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Okay? And Rabbi Akiva says, if one digs a pit in his own domain and renounces the ownership of the property around the pit, but he doesn't renounce the pit itself, so that he actually owns the pit, but the public has permission to walk up to its lip. This is the bor that is mentioned in the Torah. Okay? So what we are basically saying is even though a person didn't initially dig it in the public domain, but it was dug in the private domain, the minute you allow the public up to the point where it could dangerously allow them to fall in, you're liable in the private domain. That's according to Rashi's explanation, okay? And you must know that the Tan of our Mishnah basically maintains that you're liable for damages under the law of bor, whether you dig in the public thoroughfare or the private domain. So again, again, as far as the rabbis are concerned, they're not specific. They say you're liable both in the public and the private. We've only got an issue with regards to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Yishmael, again, has his source from what? You dig a pit in the private domain and open it up to the public. So where are you liable? To where the public are going to go. So that obviously covers the public domain, because that's where your hazard will occur of people that don't know what's going on and are not expecting to see the hazard. So that's that issue of public liability. So that's why that's the source that Rabbi Yishmael has in the Torah. Okay, and Rabbi Akiva's source is he hones on these words that the owner of the pit. So if it means the owner of the pit, you cannot renounce ownership of the pit itself. You can only renounce ownership of the area around the pit. But this is the key, is that you have to have dug it initially when it was in your own property and kept ownership of the pit. So because the public wasn't allowed at that point. And since you never demarcated an area to show for signage or warnings, etc., and you still retain ownership of the pit, you're liable in private property. That's where their sourcing is. So how do we know that sourcing? Is because, as Kevin quite rightly remembered yesterday, which was genius, in Exodus, he said it was in Exodus chapter 21, and he was spot on. It's Shemot chapter 21, verse 33 to 34, and this is how it reads. If a man shall uncover a pit, or a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or a donkey shall fall in it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. So Rabbi Akiva hones on the words, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. And then obviously the verse carries on. It says, he shall return the money to its owner and the carcass shall be his. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael focuses on the word uncovering a pit, or man shall dig a pit. So he's talking about liability of the pit. In other words, the person that created the hazard. So they're emphasizing different parts within the same pasuk. So now the Gemara is saying, look, the rabbis hold you liable for both public and private. Rabbi Akiva clearly holds you liable in the private domain, and Rabbi Yishmael in the public domain, more so, because wherever the public is going to traverse, put it that way. So the Gemara is saying, well, is there any area of agreement that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva have? That's what the Gemara wants to find out. Are they in polar opposites, or do they agree at a certain point? So Kevin asked an excellent question yesterday, and that question was, it's kind of confusing when you get the rabbis to say, this rabbi says on behalf of that rabbi, that says it on behalf of this rabbi, and what's going on here? Which I thought was obviously an astute question. And the reality is that the greatest rabbis, there was a story, I think, that Rabbi Beryl Wine described on an aeroplane. And there were two men, and the one man, his children treated him terribly on the plane. And this rabbi had children on the plane that treated him with awe and respect. And the secular Jew, the guy was a secular Jew, turned around to him and said, listen, I'm not pro-frumness exactly, but how do you get your kids to show you such respect? And how come my kids treat me terribly? He said, look, two things I want to tell you. Firstly, your kids are not your friends. Your kids will sometimes be friendly to you and sometimes not. And the degree of discipline you enforce on them will result in obviously them not being your friend at certain times. But you don't have to make friends with your children. You have to be a responsible parent. And he said, there's something else you should. He said, yes, I understand that. Sometimes I try and enforce discipline, but my children don't respect me. He said, would you like to know why? He said, well, yes, obviously. That's why I'm asking you. They were stuck on a plane for a few hours. So Gavin, this is the Rabbi Beryl Wine. He was describing this rabbi's...
Other story, I am listening. I'm just looking for something to clean my glasses. Just carry on. I'm listening completely.
All right. So the response goes as follows. I think it was on a Delta Airlines flight. It was in an internal flight in the US, maybe a 2 or 3 hour flight. He said, look, the reason why my children respect me is the closer we are to Adam HaRishon. My children believe in the Torah. And the closer I am to Adam HaRishon, the more that we're holding at a godly state. So those that are closer to Moshe Rabbeinu in the giving of the Torah are held at a higher esteem to people born in later generations. And therefore, since I'm closer to the giving of the Torah than my children, they look at me for advice that I got from my fathers and that my fathers got from their fathers. And there's the awe and respect for the older generation. You believe in evolution, and your children believe that you came from monkeys. So the further away we get from your ecological base, the more evolved your children will be, because the closer your ancestors are, the closer they resemble monkeys. And the further away they are, the more they resemble modern man. So your children won't respect you so the same degree, because you're closer to the monkey branch and we closer to the Moshe Rabbeinu holy branch. So it's a different way of looking at it, and that's why you can respect your elders if you feel they have something of value. So how does this relate to Kevin's question? And I was thinking about it, is that at the end of the day, we get our Masorah from the Timnoim. There are 5 generations. Then you have the Amoraim. Then you have the Rishonim. And so often, many of the greats that came closer to Moshe Rabbeinu, that even Moshe Rabbeinu, it said, realized that Rabbi Akiva knew certain things and knew certain ways of the Torah that Moshe didn't have a contextual relevance to, because he was living in a different time. So from there, we can learn that things that Rabbi learned from Rabbi Akiva and Rav Yishmael are things that are generations steep down, which means often we'll have a case where you'll have Rav Yosef quoting Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, or you have Rabbah quoting Rav Yosef or Rabbi Akiva or Rav Yishmael. So that's why, Kevin, they're explaining it. Is the great Tanoim are no longer alive. So the only thing we have is the later generations explaining the earlier generations. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And obviously we don't have enough there wasn't enough explanations from the earlier guys, so we had to get the later guys to explain it.
Well, they didn't need earlier explanations, because if I've got well, I'll give you an example, Gavin. If I'm friendly with you and Kevin and Arthur, and we've had chats, then if I'm speaking to your grandchildren and they say, what was my grandfather like? I would know much more than they would, because I've got a contextual relevance, because they know you as children, so they see you as a figure of your role as a grandfather, but they don't know you as being adults dealing with another adult. They've got a different contextual relevance. So Rabbah obviously now is of the later generation, and he's explaining what he learned from his teachers with regards to the opinion of Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So what does Rabbah say? Rabbah says, listen, they're not as opposing opinions as you might think. Regarding the pit in the public domain, all opinions would agree, even Rabbi Akiva, that one who digs a pit is liable to pay for the damage that it does. Okay, so in the public domain, even Rabbi Akiva would say that you're liable. Okay, why? Because the verse, just let me finish, Gavin, please let me finish. Because if one digs a pit in the private domain and opens it to the public domain, that's also mentioned in the Torah. So Rabbi is saying that all opinions, public domain, you're liable, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. What's the reason? Scripture states, if a man shall uncover a pit, and who does this refer to? Anyone who uncovers a pit that had been dug by another person. It's an existing pit, but you covered it with a manhole. It had a manhole, and you took the manhole off, you covered it. And then it adds a separate phrase, or if a man shall dig a pit, and that's referring to a new creation, a new obstacle where none had existed previously. And both impose liability on each of these men for the damage done by the pit. So now if one is liable even for the covering of an existing pit, if you uncover that and for that you're liable, isn't it obvious that when you actually create the hazard yourself, by digging a new pit, you're also liable. So the Torah, so the question is, why must the Torah state if a man shall dig a pit? Because the Torah means to allude that whether or not you dug the pit or you uncovered a pit, you're responsible. It's purely a matter of uncovering or a matter of digging, that the pit is liability issue. And it's not an issue of ownership. The only thing that you're owning is the responsibility of the hazard that you've either created or an area that was safe, that you recreated a hazard that was previously safe. Either way, this is going to the fact that both Rabbi Akiva and Rav Yishmael, according to Rabbi, is saying that you're responsible for the hazard. And it doesn't have to be a case where you own the land. So Rabbi is saying that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva disagree only regarding a pit in your own domain. Because Rabbi Akiva holds that when you dig a pit around your own domain and then you renounce ownership of the area around it, you're liable to pay for damage it does then. And how does Rabbi Akiva interpret that? Because he reads the verse, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. That's where his focus lies. But, so according to Rabbi Akiva, it talks about the merciful one, great is Hashem, who speaks of a pit that has an owner, okay? And it holds him liable, okay? But Rabbi Yishmael is not really interested in focusing on the issue of ownership, that you have to own that property. He said the expression ownership of the pit means master of the obstacle or hazard. Arthur, can you mute yourself? You've come on and you've come off and you come on. Are you sticking on the shear? I want you to stay on the shear.
The thing lost, what's the name? It lost Reshit.
Are you serious?
The spot was no
I thought
gave me error code 3. No, it gave me error code 3, so to restart the phone.
Okay, no problem. Are you with us now? I miss you.
Yeah, I'm with you now.
All right.
With you now. Well, no, it's a ghost, the shadow of me. It's
All right. So basically, Rabbi Akiva reads the word, the owner of the pit has to make restitution. That's what he's focused on. And Rabbi Ishmael turns around and says, no, it's not about the owner of the pit. It's the owner. You have to own up to the hazard you created. You're the master of this calamity you created. You need to be owned. You need to take ownership and responsibility. That's what he's saying. So they're focusing on different elements here. Okay, that's according to Rabba's opinion. Okay, I'll take questions just now, Gav. Just give me a bit of a sec. I know you had something.
No, carry on.
Okay, so accordingly, now the Gemara is going to examine Rabbi Akiva's words. Because remember, Rabbi Akiva only basically says that you're liable for a pit in a private domain. Okay? As far as Rabbi Yishmael is concerned, Rabbi Akiva is saying you're liable for a pit in a public and a private domain. That's what Rabbi says. But Rabbi Yishmael says only in a public domain, not in a private domain. Does that make sense? Okay.
Just the one, that was my question. You didn't ask me. The one question is, I don't quite see how Rabbi Akiva, I see Rabbi Yishmael, he doesn't agree with the private domain, which I'm happy with. How does Rabbi Akiva do both domains? I know if he renounces the land around it, he creates a public hazard. But what happens if somebody does, what does Rabbi Akiva say about somebody who doesn't own any property, just goes and digs a hole? Is he the owner of that? That's what I'm battling to.
Okay, but you won't have a problem with Rabbi. You'll have a problem with Rav Yosef. Let me show you why you'll have a problem only with the one.
Rabbi says that.
Kevin, give me a second. I hear your question. Just give me 1 sec. But 1 sec. Look here. Look, what? Pardon, but? Okay, Gav, can you see the screen?
Yeah, okay.
Rabbi, you cool with?
Yes.
Rabbi's cool because Rabbi says that Rabbi Akiva holds the digger liable in all circumstances. He doesn't see a difference. It's Rabbi Ishmael you've got a problem with Rabbi because he says you're only responsible in the public domain.
So I'm fine with that. I've got a problem with how does he say that Rabbi Akiva is fine in both instances? I don't understand how Rabbi Akiva in the public domain, except for that instance where he renounces the property around him, originally owned the land. That's an example of a public, but it's not all the examples of public. The examples are public where you never own the land and you just dug a pit. Rabbi Ishmael says that even if you dig a pit in the public domain, whether you own the land or not, irrelevant. You have to take responsibility and ownership of that pit.
Okay, so I'll explain it. I'll explain it to you now. All right. So this is what Rabbi is saying. He's saying, look, the very fact that Scripture states that whether you uncover an existing pit or you create a new hazard, this is an issue of liability for a hazard you create. And that's why he holds that both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael is saying that you're responsible for the hazard that you create. Okay? Where, as far as Rabbi Ishmael is concerned, he said, what you do in your private domain is your business. Okay? He doesn't focus on the word. He basically will say that what are you doing coming into my private property, even if I've made that area around it open for workmen's, etc. You had no permission to be there. That's a difficult thing to explain. I think it's not about explaining Rabbi Ishmael or Rabbi Akiva that's difficult. It's difficult to see how anybody could only focus on liability in the one area. That's my issue. Yeah. In other words, I don't have any issue with the rabbi saying you liable any area where somebody gets hurt, where you're responsible for not being cautious, you liable. I've got no problem with the rabbis. I don't understand why their emphasis is on the focus of one to the exclusion of the other.
Correct. That I don't understand, and I don't understand how Rabbi comes to the conclusion that Rabbi Akiva is fine in both areas.
Well, I tell you why he's fine in both areas. Let me explain. Okay, just give me a chance to explain, though. The reason why he's saying he's comfortable is he's saying, look, Rabbi Akiva can't ignore the verse. He can't ignore. He might have an emphasis to include the private domain. He might have an emphasis to like be quite specific because it said the owner of the pit shall make restitution. But him and Rabbi Ishmael have both got to cover the public domain because it's talking about the fact of liability here. You've created a pit yourself. You've dug a pit. You're liable. You've uncovered a hazard that was previously safe. You're liable. It's an issue of liability. And that's why Rabbi says both the rabbis, Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, agrees that in the public domain you're liable. In the matter of, they only disagree in the matter of a private domain because Rabbi Akiva specifically holds that you're liable of a pit of your own owning if you renounce the area around it. So he's focusing on that. What I don't understand is how you could say Rabbi Ishmael wouldn't say you're liable in that particular instance. That's my issue. Not where they agree with both points of view. With Rabbi Yosef as well as Rabbi with Rav Yosef as well as with Rabbi, when they only emphasize one point is a problem. But let's just try and see if we can get through it. Give me a bit of a chance. Okay. So what we're saying here is, look, at the end of the day, public domain, according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael agree that you create a hazard or you actually make something that was safe dangerous, again, you're liable. It's an issue of liability. And only in the private domain is Rabbi Akiva's emphasis because he sees the owner of the pit must make restitution. Rabbi Ishmael saying in your own private territory, it's not such an issue. That's what it says. But then the issue that the Gemara has is it's saying to Rabbi Akiva, so then why did Rabbi Akiva have the words that this is the bore that is mentioned in the Torah regarding a pit in the private domain? In other words, if it's saying Rabbi, if you're right, that Rabbi Akiva agrees with both opinions, why is his wording focused only on the private domain? Because it would seem it's at the exclusion of the public domain. How do you explain that? So Rabbi is saying, listen, all Rabbi Akiva is saying is that this is the board that the Torah begins with regards to its reference to restitution. So it's saying it has to begin somewhere. So Rabbi Akiva says, well, this is the point at which the issue of responsibility starts. But it's not at the exclusion of the public domain. So that's Rabbi's answer to why Rabbi Akiva has that emphasis. He's saying, wait, Gavin, he's saying that's the starting point, but he's not saying that's the full level of liability. It's not at the exclusion of anything else.
I think you're 100% right. I think what's happening is that there's missing information, and he's trying to fill in the blanks, Rabbi. And it's obvious that Rabbi Akiva would not ignore the second, like we're saying. He's dealt with the first part of the issue.
He can't ignore what's in the Torah, correct. If it's clear in the Torah, correct.
Correct. So we only have Rabbi Akiva's opinion, obviously, that's all they've got on the first part. So on the second part, he's basically extrapolating the second part based on the second part of what the Torah says, where the guy takes the manhole off or where he digs a pit. And he's saying that Rabbi Akiva would agree with that. So
Rabbi Akiva can't ignore what's in the Torah, clearly. Correct. So he's saying, well, how do you explain Rabbi Akiva focusing on one area? He's saying, why he's focusing on that area is because that's where the liability starts. Yeah. That's the starting point. Okay. So now there's a dissenting opinion. Now Rav Yosef is going the other way around. What's the other way around? He's saying, look, regarding a pit that's in one private domain, if it's in your private domain, Kevin, all would agree, even Rabbi Yishmael, that you're liable to pay for the damage that it does. What's the reason? The merciful one states, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, which indicates we are dealing with the pit that has an owner. In other words, one who has a pit in a private domain. So all can agree with that verse because it's in the Torah. So it's saying that even... What, Gav?
Is that whether you have permission or not?
Hang on a second, Gavin. It says clearly in the Torah, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. So what Rav Yosef is saying, just give me a sec. What Rav Yosef is saying is you cannot ignore it. Rabbi Akiva cannot ignore it, neither can Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael is usually seen as the public domain expert, can't ignore the fact the owner of the pit is liable. He can't ignore that because Hashem said it. The merciful one stated the owner of the pit shall make restitution. It's in the Torah Deraisa. So what Rav Yosef is saying is that Rabbi Yishmael can't ignore that. It's obvious that he agrees with that. So they both agree that in the private domain you're liable. There's no issue with that. He's saying what's the issue of contention is that in the public domain, Rabbi Yishmael said that you're liable to pay for damages that you do, but Rabbi Akiva says it's purely focused on private domain. That's Rav Yosef's opinion. Is that they can't ignore the owner of the pit, that verse. So they both. So Rav Yosef is saying both Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva agree with the owner of the pit is liable. You can't ignore that. And where do they disagree? Rav Yishmael said you're even liable in the public domain. Rabbi Akiva said no. Okay, so he's saying the opposite to Rabbi in terms of the emphasis. Right. So how do we find the explanation for this? And that explanation is redundancy. That's the explanation. So, Kevin, what do we mean by redundancy of verse? What did we learn about a Gezerah Shava?
Kevin, your mark's off, man. Kevin, your mark.
Gezerah Shava. If there are words in another pasuk, it can be derived. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe I'm getting mixed up with the Gezerah Shava and a Kal V'chomer.
No, you're not. You said it correctly. What Kevin said.
Okay, so if there are words, and there's in the commentaries in Rashi or Tosfot,
yes,
it refers to another another masechta or another verse, then I don't know. Yeah, it has relevance, and it's is it got to do with the superfluousness of certain words?
Excellent. That's the answer. That's the answer. So while you're on the right track, that's the answer. The answer is as follows: is that Rabbi Akiva, he sees these words as being superfluous, right? That in other words, let's look at this. Rabbi Akiva is saying you don't need mention of the fact that in the public domain that you need coverage, because the minute you've got a private domain and you let it open to the public is being exposed. Okay, so that's fine, but it's talking about something that's yours that you let the public into, and you've created a hazard in that respect. In other words, you've got a private domain that you renounced ownership of the surrounding area, but not of the pit. Therefore, you created the hazard. That's the focus. So they were saying, well, what about the pasuk with regards to about covering the pit of a manhole of an existing pit or digging a new pit? It's coming to show you liable in the public domain. Because Rabbi Yishmael says you liable in the public and private domain. And Rabbi Akiva, you say you're only liable in the public domain. And yes, he's saying, I don't need it to teach me you liable in the public domain, because that pasuk is coming to teach you other lessons. And as long as I can show you it's teaching other lessons, it's not redundant. It's not meaning to mean you liable in the public domain. What it's meaning to do is teach you lessons. Does that make sense, guys? So what lessons is it meaning to teach you? So we'll go through this now. And then when you see it, there's no redundancy, in that case, you can see it from Rabbi Akiva's opinion. So I'll tell you. Yeah.
Sorry. Are they emphasizing the private domain? Because the public domain, we know that if a person digs a hole, a pit, they're liable if there's damages. But in the private domain, it's maybe placing more emphasis on a pit. It's in the private domain that someone is liable, the digger's liable.
Correct. So Rav Yosef is emphasizing a private domain, and Rabbah, R-A-B-B-A-H, is emphasizing a public domain. That's correct. The emphasis is on different points. That's exactly it. So in other words, Rabbah is saying there's consensus as far as the public domain is concerned, all is liable. According to Rav Yosef, all is liable in the private domain. That's where the consensus lies. Exactly, Kevin. It's exactly where the emphasis is lying. The dispute is where there's no emphasis. That's exactly it. That's the point. So we want to see how Rabbi Akiva uses the verse about covering an existing pit that you've uncovered and basically dealing with the hazard you created. If he can show that there's logical reasons that both parts of that pasuk are mentioned, and there's proper reasons there, then he doesn't have to say that you're liable in the public domain, because he's explained it away as not talking about issues of the public domain, but talking about issues of why you need to know these facts, that it's meant to teach you certain lessons. As long as he can explain it, then it doesn't need to be applied to a public domain. You get it? You get it? Let me explain what they are. So the lessons are as follows. For it is written, if a man shall uncover a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit, etc. Now, if one is liable, even of the uncovering of an existing pit that has been dug by another and then covered, isn't it obvious that you're liable for digging a new pit? So what the Gemara is saying is, look, if you're liable and you didn't create the hazard, but you merely made it dangerous again, obviously when you create a hazard from scratch and you've created something dangerous from nothing at all, you're definitely liable. So that's obvious. What I'm going to say to you is, as long as Rabbi Akiva can show those verses, Kevin, are needed to explain a very novel concept, then they don't have to be used to explain why you're liable in the public domain. That's the essence of what we're dealing with here in the Gemara. So what are the reasons that both those verses are mentioned? Well, quite clearly, it's starting off with a logical premise that's saying, look, at the end of the day, if you've got an obligation to cover a pit of a hazard you never created originally, but you made dangerous by uncovering the manhole, you're liable. So why would you have to mention the fact that if you dig a new pit, you're liable? It's obvious. So the fact that the Torah mentioned that means it shows you liable in the public domain for a pit that you dig, because it's superfluous. You don't need to know that from logic. That's what it's trying to show. In other words, if I said to you guys, there's an existing pit that's been covered and it's safe. You never created the hazard. If you take off the manhole, you're liable. I wouldn't have to tell you guys that you're liable if you create a hazard from scratch. It's even more dangerous. Obviously, you're liable. And therefore, that's coming to teach you you're liable in the public domain. It's obvious, because it's teaching you something that is obviously could have been inferred from logic. Therefore, you can take that and say it's teaching liability in the public domain. Okay. Or you could turn around and say, if it teaches you about digging an existing pit, maybe why would I need to teach you about covering a manhole? As long as we've got reasons for it, we don't have to use it as an explanation for public liability. So let me just read the Gemara and I'll explain it. Okay. Just I need a few, no questions for a few minutes. If a man shall uncover a pit or a man shall dig a pit, etc. Now, if one is liable even over the uncovering of an existing pit that had been dug by another and then uncovered, is it not obvious that he's also liable over the digging of a new pit? Why must the Torah state, or if a man shall dig? Rather, the Torah is meant to allude that there's purely a matter over uncovering or undigging the pit, that liability is incurred by him, but not over the matter of owning it. Thus, the Torah holds a man liable when he uncovers or digs a pit in the public domain where he does not own the land. So the Gemara is turning around and saying very, very straightforwardly that the very fact that it's mentioning both of these issues means that the Torah wants to cover its basis and say that you are liable. This is a case of liability. It's not a case of ownership. What's the proof? If I uncover something that's existing, do I own that existing hazard? Yes or no? It was existing before I got there. No.
You'll never own it.
You never own it. If there's a sewerage system and there's a manhole, do I own the municipality plumbing works? No. So if I take off the manhole, did I create that infrastructural municipal mechanism for plumbing? No. So then clearly it's not a case of ownership, it's a case of liability for a hazard. That's the argument against Rabbi Akiva. So what is Rabbi Akiva's argument to that? I'm not using an example of digging a new pit. Even, by the way, with digging a new pit, it doesn't mean I have to own the land. I can just dig a pit in an area where that land is public property. We all own it, or none of us own it, but it's not particularly ownership exclusive to me. And the minute it's not ownership exclusive to me, I can't be said as owning it exclusively like my own house. And therefore, especially an existing pit, you don't own. All right. So what's Rabbi Akiva's opinion to this? Rabbi Akiva would argue and say that those verses are both necessary. Why? What two verses? If a man shall uncover and if a man shall dig. Because it doesn't come to allude that we're dealing with an ownerless pit. That's what he's saying. Why? Because if you have a look, for if the merciful one had written only the verse, if a man shall uncover a pit and not cover it again, he's liable, I might have come to the conclusion that for one who merely uncovers an existing pit, that covering it again is sufficient in order to be absolved of liability. In other words, it's sufficient that I put a manhole back on the pit if I take off the manhole. But if I dug a new pit, it's not sufficient to put a covering of a manhole, and I might still be liable until I fill it with earth again. That's what Rabbi Akiva is saying. How do you know? Because if you put a manhole on the back in, it could be that when there are a lot of vibrations from cars or animals, Kevin, or something like that, that the manhole lifts of its own volition because of the level of vibration. So I would think maybe that's enough because, listen, this ain't my hole, it's not my problem. Somebody else dug their hole, that's their problem. I took the manhole off, that's my problem because now I've created a hazard. But since I'm putting the manhole back, I left it in the state I found it. I can wash my hands of it, it's not my responsibility. So then I'm not as liable. But in digging a new pit, I might say it's not good enough to put a manhole because I've actually created an original hazard here. And therefore, because I could lift from the vibrations of cars and horses and traffic, etc., I have to fill it with earth. So Rabbi Akiva is saying you don't have to. This is proving that just putting a manhole on top of a pit you created frees you from liability. Hence, you're not liable in the public domain. Okay, that's his first proof. Does that make sense? You don't have to fill it with earth again. It's sufficient to put a manhole. You're not liable in the public domain. Okay, but what happens, and implying that if he did cover it properly, a victim fell in nonetheless, he is exempt, even though he dug the pit, because he put a manhole, it's good enough. And if the merciful one had written only if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, he is liable, I might have said that it is for the digging of the pit that covering is required in order to free the digger of liability, because he performed an original act, creating the new obstacle. In other words, the reason he's liable is he created this hazard from the start. But one who merely uncovers an existing pit that had been covered didn't perform an original act because the hazard was there to start with. So I might say in that case, that even covering it is not required, and therefore, because he didn't create the pit, he's entirely free from liability. So Rabbi Akiva would say, Scripture needs to tell you that the least you need to do is put the manhole back. Does that make sense? Liability is occurring whether you create a new pit or uncovering an existing one, but you've freed from liability merely by covering the pit. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva argues that since both verses are necessary, there's no basis for inferring that the Torah holds a person liable over the uncovering or digging of a pit in the public domain where he doesn't own the land. You merely have to put a manhole cover on it. That's all. That's all. Does that make sense, guys? Okay.
Oh,
So,
no,
Yeah.
I'm yelling. I understand you 100%.
fine. So now there's
Damon,
an argument. Just give me 1 sec. There's an argument to Rav Yosef's explanation. There's only one argument because that explains quite clearly why Rabbi Akiva only holds one liable when the pit is in his private domain, in which case he's literally the owner of the pit. So according to Rav Yosef's explanation, Rav Yishmael holds a person liable under the law of Bor. Doesn't matter whether he digs a pit in the public or private domain, whereas Rabbi Akiva holds him liable when he digs a pit in the private domain. So one thing here, quickly, is in light of this, there's a question then to Rabbi Yishmael. It's saying that since Rabbi Yishmael, you make one liable in the public and private domain, why do you use your source for the Bor, for the hazard, mentioned in the Torah by saying that it's talking about the public domain? Why are you so specific? Why didn't you just say you covered for everything? Why are you alluding to a specific verse which seems to imply you only hold one liable in the public domain? So Rav Yosef's explanation is Rabbi Yishmael is merely starting with this phrase. This is the ball with which the Torah begins its reference to damages. Does that make sense? It's merely the beginning. It's not saying it's It's comprehensive. It's not saying it's only about the public. It's comprehensive with everything. It's only starting at that point of public and agreeing with private. Okay, so what do we mean? Is that according to Rav Yosef, Rav Yishmael would tell Rabbi Akiva, how can you exempt a person from liability for damage by a pit that he dug in the public domain that he doesn't literally own? So in other words, Rav Yosef is almost posing this question as if he was Rabbi Yishmael and saying to Rabbi Akiva, understand how you hold somebody liable in the private domain, but how can you not hold somebody liable in the public domain? In which case, Rabbi Akiva would give the answer to Rabbi Yishmael about just covering a manhole suffices, whether it's a pit you dug or a pit that you opened up, just cover the hazard. That's what Rabbi Akiva's explanation would be to Rabbi Yishmael. But that's the way Rabbi Yishmael would pose the question. Now, according to Rabbi, how would Rabbi Akiva pose the question to Rabbi Yishmael? Okay, Rabbi Akiva would say to Rabbi Yishmael, how can you exempt a person from liability for damage by a pit in his own domain? Okay, and obviously, clearly there, the question was answered by Rabbi, and Rabbi said that regarding the pit in the public domain, both agree, but in the private domain, what's the reason that Rabbi Yishmael focuses on the public domain? Because that's the issue of liability. It's not an issue of ownership. It doesn't matter whichever domain you're dealing with an issue of liability, not of ownership. So I think this has added a lot of clarity to what we're dealing with here, guys.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, Kevin, you're right there. And Arthur?
Now I want to ask Damon a question.
Sure.
If somebody comes across a pit in the public domain,
yes,
why would they uncover it? They're not the owner. They're private, non-owner, someone just comes and uncovers it. Yeah. Why would they do that in the first place?
Okay, Kevin's asking a good question because, Kevin, not everybody was raised. I know both your parents, and they're good people, and they're honest people, and they've got morality and ethics. Some people were raised by wolves. I'm telling you that some people had no proper upbringing in terms of manners, conscience, responsibility, and sometimes even when people had wonderful parents, they're sociopaths. They don't care about damaging others. You only have to look at the news every day to the fact that people smack another person's car in the parking lot and they don't leave their name and number. People are horrendous. This is why the courts are full. People have no morality. This goes to a greater question. I know last year, Yom Kippur, not last year, 2 years Yom Kippur, I had the convertible with the roof open and somebody keyed my car across all the two doors and you know what? That's my fault. And it taught me that when you drive a convertible, nobody's ever done that with the beaten up Hyundai Elantra. Why? Because the beggars don't even ask me for money when I drive that car. They say, can I help you? So the thing of it is, if you create jealousy amongst people, you're also to blame because they're going through a difficult financial time. And people's attitudes are, if I'm not happy, why should you be happy? It comes from a state of unhappiness and of the fact that people are miserable and they're selfish and they're panicky. And certain people on the sociopathic level enjoy hurting other people or certainly don't care to hurt as long as their needs are met. So this goes to a greater question, is that the courts are full because people don't listen to the Torah. I mean, why would you have to even have the Torah tell you don't steal? Surely if you do not want somebody to take something of yours, you know not to do it to others. If you don't want somebody to sleep with your wife, you don't sleep with their wife. It's obvious. If you don't want it to, as Rabbi Hillel said, on one foot to the convert, if you don't want it done to you, don't do it to others. That's the essence of the Torah. Go learn the commentary on how to apply the law. But why are the non-Jews held responsible? Because they're saying we didn't believe in this Torah, we didn't accept it. Because the simple question is, would you have liked somebody to take something away from you that you worked hard for? The answer is no. Would you like somebody to to abuse your wife when in fact she was only yours? No. Would you like your wife to have an affair on you when in fact you were honest and you didn't cheat on your wife? No. So why do it to somebody else? Those are the questions Hashem is going to ask a person at the end of days. Were you honest in business? Did you cheat others? And these are very big issues of importance. I'd like to dedicate, hang on a second, I'd like to dedicate this year, just wait, Gavin. Arthur, Max's Hebrew's name. Max Tucker passed away. He was a dear friend of Arthur. I knew him well. He used to run the bookstore, Manny's bookstore in Geula. He was the ex-South African, and he was married to Arthur.
Put your mark on, Arthur, if you are there.
He passed away yesterday, so his funeral was today, so we can do the dedication to him today. Arthur, would you like to put on your mark? Arthur?
Yeah. Maybe it's too noisy, eh? I've also got a guy that died on Sunday, a friend of mine. I don't know his Hebrew name. I was very close to him in Cape Town, a guy called Jeremy Pinn. He had a motorbike accident.
Jewish guy.
Jewish guy, and he left behind 2 children. I mean, he was a wealthy guy, did very well financially, but the thing is, but an absolute mensch and a gentleman. The whole community is very upsetting, guys. Everybody knows him.
What's his name? What's his English name? It's good enough for now.
If we can just dedicate it for him as well, Jeremy Pinn.
Jeremy Pinn and Max Tucker.
Yeah, I'm sorry, mate. My wife called me there for a second. It cut me off. I don't know I don't have it. I'll find out from his wife.
All right. And listen, just Gab, hang on for me one sec. I want to send the share to Debbie to mention it in dedication of Max Tucker. Okay. And I think she'd appreciate it.
I've got a picture of him as well, which I'll send to you.
So send it to
her. I'll send
it
tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Sounds good.
You don't really
I'll
get
see if she can get, if she'll reply. I'll talk to the daughter. What Max's,
All right, guys, you've got 10 minutes to get ready for Simcha Steinhaus Shir Rab Simcha Steinhaus. Okay, I hope today. Okay, I hope today added clarity to us all.
Absolutely. Thanks, Damon, for putting on it. I really appreciate it. Kevin does, and Arthur does if you can hear it as well.
Okay, but do you see why we decided to do it again? Because I want to share something of the screen, and the bottom line is that this thing with Rabba and Rav Yosef is the whole Gemara. This is exactly the logic, and it's testing these guys. It's testing Rabba and it's testing Rav Yosef to know that they've interpreted Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva correctly. And they both could answer the questions, every one from the Gemara.
I'll tell you what it did, because besides this, because this is very specific, what you did is that you actually gave us a very good understanding on the framework of how the Gemara actually kind of functions, And from that perspective, that was an absolute win. Because this message we might forget, but we're not going to forget the message. I don't think we will forget this either. But the actual message of how the Gemara functions and how it's structured, it was coming from Kevin's question yesterday. He started the whole thing.
Yes.
Yes, and you kind of expounded on it now. And I think that was very, it's kind of like I knew what, not Gavari Shava, I knew the other one very well, but I didn't know Gavari Shava. So, and also you just clarified a lot of those issues. So you're helping us to get to understand how Gemara functions and operates and works. So from that perspective, well done. I think it was really good for me and I'm sure for everybody else.
Pleasure. And I just read this quote because I felt very useless when I learned the Gemara today. And I felt like sometimes I feel that I think I've missed the point or I didn't understand it and I have to go back at it and learn it again. So there's a quote by Dr. Norman Finkelstein. Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He's
Norman Finkelstein.
Yeah, he's a political analyst.
Ah, yes.
So you know what he says? The American. You know what he says? And it gave me a chizuk today. If ever you feel useless, remember, it took 20 years trillions of dollars and 4 US presidents to replace the Taliban with the Taliban.
Yeah.
So listen, it's actually really sad, but it's great for hopefully for my business, because hopefully the dollar will stop plummeting.
100%. But guys, listen, sometimes I feel a bit useless because I read it and I think I understand it, and then I think, hang on a second. The bottom line is the Gemara is trying to punch holes in theories. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to come out and say, does your theory work and will it hold up to scrutiny? Let's find other brises that might contradict it to see if it's going to float and if it will last the test of time. And that's why we come up with a certain halachic opinion.
Listen, it's really theoretic. I mean, it's a really amazing Gemara. I mean, the fact that you've got all these guys, Stan Liederman, Schottenstein, all these guys, so intrigued by it and learn. These are geniuses,
And Rabbi Ran Cohen, exactly.
Rabbi Ran Cohen. These guys are so absorbed. I mean, they don't even focus that much on political stuff, on the news and other stuff, because they're so focused. They do a bit, but the most is primarily on this. It's unbelievable, because they see the value in it. This it stretches them, to the max. It doesn't matter how bright you are. It's really amazing, and it really caters for all different type of people, including people like Kevin and me and Arthur.
And me, and me, because I think I've read it and I've understood it. And you know what? I put in another bit of an hour today, and I figured, listen, you're missing the point. Something's not making sense here. Why? What's this issue about redundancy? What are they talking about redundancy of verses? If it is redundant, what does it mean? What does it prove? Yeah. So, you have to roll up the sleeves.
It was a great example to cover what you did. It was really good. Thank you.
Pleasure. But I think it takes a humbleness where I have to learn, where you have to learn and say, listen, did you get it? No, I didn't. I'm not smart enough. Let me go back. Let me do it again. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it enough.
Well, to be fair, Kevin phoned me after the show yesterday and he said that he thinks Damon didn't do it right.
Yeah, it's true. So I was missing.
Not a mistake. He actually sent me a whole list. I can send you the list if you want. It's like massive. It's about 60 points that Kevin bulleted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Kevin, I deserved a bullet. No, but you know what the thing of it is, it's got to make sense in the most simple explanation, because it means we've complicated it too much. And the more simple we make it, the more we can understand it and build layers. So it takes work. It actually takes work.
I'm going to notice that just generally in life, just let me tell you something quite interesting, is that you need to keep it simple. I remember I once spoke to you this about Damon. I've also got a problem with this. Don't overtalk. Stick to the facts. Keep it short. These guys, even the rabbis do that as well. They're right to the point. And these guys specifically, but if you look at the guys on the news and that, these top guys in America, Fox News, all of that, these guys take complex issues and they make it simple so you can understand it. It's really remarkable. So that's really the skill set, is to make it simple so that average person can really understand. And I think hopefully we are above average myself, but I think we're above average if you put all three of us together, excluding you. If you add you, then we'll be a little bit higher. Yeah, so listen, that's how the world works. You have to try to keep it as simple as possible. But try to simplify.
Yeah, and listen, thank you for your patience for doing the Chazorah, but I honestly didn't understand what this issue of redundancy is and the cross-questioning. I felt irritated. And the reason I felt irritated is that I realized the irritation is with myself, not with the Gemara, is that I missed the point of what it was trying to say. I actually missed the point. I understood it, but I missed the point of the nuances of what it's actually trying